I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Freeform, a world that just might work. And I'm going to be speaking today with Melanie Challenger, who writes on the relationship of humans to the rest of the living world. Her books include How to Be Animal, What It Means to Be Human. And you can learn more at Melanie Challenger, all one word, just as it sounds, melaniechallenger.com. On Freeform, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at economics, politics, environment, science, health, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn. Podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, most major podcast sites, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net. I've long made clear that I do not consider myself an environmentalist, but rather that I work to move society toward a healthy relationship with the rest of nature. The notion that we are separate from the rest of nature makes no sense to me. I mean, there's irony here. Our unique to human form of intellect has developed methods and technologies that enable us to learn more and more accurately and in more and more detail on a broader canvas how the world works. And the more we know we don't know. Things we were taking for granted when I was growing up, many have been challenged, amended, and replaced. And that's true as well for things we assume true within the last decade. Culture and conventional wisdom would have a hard time keeping up even in a healthy communication environment. And sadly, that's not what we have. Consider the octopus. I know I'm singling out a superstar, but in the last few years, through a documentary or two, a fairly mainstream audience has learned about the truly amazing abilities of the octopus. They are able to change their color, shape, appearance to camouflage themselves. It is miraculous to see. So, can humans do abstract thinking, computation, invention, and so much more that we may assume is impossible for the octopod? Of course. But their organism transforms in color and shape in real time. We need to invent tools to accomplish the same. I did an episode in July with Zoe Schlanger on her book, The Light Eaters, How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers a New Understanding of Life on Earth. In recent years, we've learned about the ability of plants to communicate, to recognize kin and behave socially, to store useful memories, to morph their bodies to blend into their surroundings, and to trick animals into behaving to their benefit, revealing a reality that challenges our understanding of agency, consciousness, intelligence. I recently published an episode with Martin Goodman on his book, My Head for a Tree, The Extraordinary Story of the Bishnoi, Guardians of Nature, a 500-year-old religion of 3 million people in India who even today will give their life to save that of an animal or a tree. These are dark days, and it feels like a lot hangs in the balance. Maybe it's especially dark in the US, but I'm afraid when it comes to the global challenges we face, we still cast a long shadow. Stopped in traffic, on hold on the phone, my mind drifts all too often to the latest Trump-related outrage. So I'm looking for light where I can find it. I find myself looking upstream, big picture, tracking new revelations or new understandings. And I turn today to Melanie Challenger. Her website lists her research interests as, are you ready? History of ideas, history and anthropology of science, environmental history and philosophy, bioethics, animal welfare, and political philosophy. Juicy as those look to me, they're only her research interests. She's also an award-winning poet, and it shows in her writing. She does field research, including in the Arctic and Antarctic. She's written librettos for award-winning classical choral pieces, has an opera in the works, and is vice president of the UK's RSPCA. The book that caught my attention is How to Be Animal. I confess, I don't know when I first realized we were animals. I probably had to let go of some Roman Catholic dogma to get there. Perhaps psychedelics were involved in pulling back the curtain, but it feels like it has been my reality for most or all of my adult life. Looking at Challenger's work has reminded me that I'm probably in the vast minority. She argues that at the heart of contemporary psychology is our profound struggle with being animal. The book looks at how this came to be and its impact on our lives. Her other books on extinction and animal dignity, as well as her roles in animal welfare, make clear she's an explorer who is on a quest. And sure enough, she is a 2025 National Geographic Explorer. And her current explorations include the roles of agency and purpose in the natural world. By the way, I really like her website photo. It's flattering, but more than that, it communicates a feeling. She looks a bit tickled, as if she knows she does serious work, but she enjoys doing it, and you might enjoy learning about it. And to anyone who questions whether I would make the same comment about a man and his photo, I like to think I would, and I'm pretty sure I have. Melanie Challenger is the current deputy co-chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, vice president of RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, co-founder Animals in the Room, which generates new models for representing the interests of non-human life and public policy, and hosts the podcast The Psychosphere on intelligence and agency in nature. Welcome, Melanie Challenger, to Freeform, a world that just might work.
Thank you, Terence. I've giggled my way through the intro at various times. So yeah, happy to be here.
Great. Let me tell listeners we're recording this conversation Wednesday, October 15th. So I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas we talk about. So I went through highlights, left, right, center, and so on. But can you tell us briefly in your own words how you see your path to the work you do today, the life you lead? And feel free to go way back, childhood inspirations, mentors, turning points, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? I get asked what it is that I do, and I often get a kind of baffled look by journalists who wanting to give a name for what it is that I do, or wanting me to give a name for what it is. And there isn't one. I mean, I often say that I like to think that I'm kind of like an old-fashioned natural philosopher, and that's not to self-aggrandize. It's just because back then we weren't in these silos. You could write poems, you could do philosophy, politics, you could stray across history, you could wander in the world as a naturalist, and it all came under a kind of open-hearted exploration of the world that was both serious and creatively sort of active. We don't allow ourselves very often to do that anymore, which is a great restriction on many people's lives. And I've sort of been a mischief maker in just being absolutely determined to try and express that freedom in my professional life. And it's not always been easy, and it's not always paid well, but it's been worth it for the freedom.
Oh, makes great sense to me. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even to say what I do, even on these sets of conversations, which I've been doing now for 25 years, it would be easier probably for all concerned if I said, okay, I do economics, I do politics, I do
Yeah.
science, but I don't, it's
No, and you know we need that kind of breadth now. I spent a long time feeling ashamed of it and giving these kind of lengthy just so stories about how I was always into nature when I was younger, but I was also really interested in history, and I sort of started then the arts, and I would tell this kind of meandering story to sort of justify why
right.
I work across so many different fields. But the reality is that I do it because I can't answer the question with one set of tools, the sorts of questions that I like to ask. And actually, I think the kind of challenges that we face today require that kind of synthesizing of knowledge and that kind of breadth of critical kind of thinking. But actually, many of us are being I don't want to say shamed into not doing it, but it's made difficult with the way that the professional
Yes.
infrastructure is such that it's made very difficult now.
Yeah, no, I mean, whether it's academia for sure, silos people, but then people just like to know where to put you. What,
Yes.
that whole expression of staying in your lane,
Yeah.
we don't do it when we're driving. Why should we do it with our lives?
Yes,
Um,
when we probably should, indeed. Yeah.
yeah. Um, and I was also, as you were saying, that you think we need this kind of this broader view, this more well-rounded experience or set of interests to deal with some of the challenges we face. Absolutely. In fact, what I was thinking as you were saying that was it was the lack of it that created many of them,
Yeah. I
right?
think that's true. I think it's very difficult to anticipate risk, for example, unless you have that kind of breadth there. It's difficult to think about what the concept that you might be using as the basis of a justification even means if you don't think more widely. I mean, there are so many ways in which it shuts down, um, the light of thought, if you like.
Well,
You
and
end up with
also
very,
if you are proceeding to tinker with the world or meddle with the world or with our technologies and so on, really take it on, and you're doing it in a reductionist way that isn't the way the world actually shows up, you're going to be hard pressed to you're using an inadequate tool
yeah.
when you do that. One thing that I thought of just as I was about to sit down here was I would love for you to share with me just a little bit any reflections you have on Jane Goodall, who we just lost in the last week.
Oh. Yeah, I've been thinking about Jane a lot actually. I've been thinking about who we have, who's going to follow in her footsteps, I suppose. I mean, so my own personal experience with Jane, obviously, like many people engaged in questions of intelligence in life and agency in biology and so forth, Jane was someone, is someone who is a landmark along the way. You discover her work and then you discover her story alongside her work and the impact that she had. So I'd known obviously about her work and her contribution for a long time, but much later, as I was kind of, I guess, sort of emerging as someone working in questions of ethics and animal welfare, I got directly involved with Jane. She contributed to a small film that I was part of, and we met one another that way. And then she wrote a foreword for a volume I edited called Animal Dignity. And so I was able to, interact with her directly, and she's incredibly funny, which you don't sort of often see because she was um,
Oh,
so
right, right. Yeah,
yeah, you don't see it,
once
right?
we sort of make someone a saint, we forget they have a sense of humor.
Yeah, she had a wicked sense of humor there. She was tough. She was like tough-minded. And again, we see she went out there as a professional who saw it as her mission, really, to pretty much flog herself, going out there and making sure that we understood and that we could reconnect people back to the living world, but also do that in a morally active way, get people really engaged with why nature matters and why other living beings matter. And she was hitting the road all the time to do that. And so we saw her as this kind of very serious figure all the time. But in fact, she was really playful, she was really fun. And it's an enormous loss. And I think a lot about, we think that science is so much easier now and it might be, more possible for someone like Jane to come through. But I just sadly don't think that that's true. And, people are underfunding science, they don't trust science. And, so I think there are a lot of barriers still to someone as special as Jane kind of emerging.
Wow. I hadn't thought of it that way. It's interesting. You're so much closer to her in terms of your field that you would think who's going to, who's going to step into that breach. I just thought, she was sui generis. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
she was Jane. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit more about your path. You talked about how you need to approach the world, asking your questions from different viewpoints. I think that a real broad stretch there is that you began your career in the creative arts, classical music, literature, and how did you find yourself? Was there did you experience a transition, or is it just front burner, back burner, front burner, back burner? How does that work
Mm.
for? How did that happen, and how does it work for you?
Yeah, okay. So this is, I mean, it's difficult to give a pithy answer to this because it is actually quite a kind of convoluted reality. So I think first and foremost, I am a creative. I'm still a creative. Ultimately, I started as a poet, and I wanted to write novels. And actually, the first agent that I had, the first sort of publishing um, relationship that I had was to write fiction when I was very young. I was only in my kind of mid-20s, and I withdrew from that. And the reason that I did, even though I was sort of quite precociously sort of getting out there, was because basically I was always asking philosophical questions
Mm,
through my creativity.
mm-hmm.
I was always asking the same sorts of questions that I ask in my nonfiction. And I think some of it was that I didn't have the maturity. I didn't have, I was looking at people like Kafka. I could see that there were people I could aspire to in the past who had managed to achieve the philosophical novel, but it's devilishly difficult to do. And I certainly couldn't do it in my mid-20s. And so I ended up sort of quite frustrated and sort of railing against what
Mm,
it was that I could get the art form to achieve for me.
uh-huh.
So I withdrew a bit and I sidestepped into nonfiction, sort of creative nonfiction at first, which then became or has become more polemical as time has gone on. Um, and then I sort of looped back into so I went quite far away in some ways from creative writing, and then I partly got pulled back in actually by colleagues, but then I also kind of drifted back into it myself. And it's interesting that this latest book that I've been working on has little fictional episodes within it. So I've really now knitted them together in one form where there is, fiction and non-fiction sort of woven together. But yeah, ultimately, I can't answer as clearly and cleanly as I would like the sorts of questions that I am really turning in my mind only through
Right.
fiction and poetry. And I think that proceeds as a writer. I think actually you need both. You cannot make a really robust argument, for example, about agency in nature without going into some pretty solid science. And that isn't going to sit comfortably in a novel, for example, where you're driving storytelling and narrative and
Mm-hmm.
character development. So in the end, these are trade-offs. And I've tried to find some sort of way in which I can keep that creative side of myself alive, but I can also really focus on the inquiries that matter to me.
Now, it does seem to me, by the way, that two things that when you talk about sort of getting pulled back in and then, finding, well, I want to pull myself back in, is that now you do have two things you didn't have then. You have some maturity,
Yeah.
and you have some recognition, which allows you to sort of do what people don't expect you to do a little bit because you're who you are. In your 20s, it was who needs you.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
um
no, it's true, but and I have mulled whether I could, whether what it would be like if I were to embark on what it was I was trying to do in my 20s now in my 40s. Um, but I'm still fresh off of a nonfiction book, so I just don't know right now.
right, I understand. And then let's leap to another couple of parts of your life. Talk a bit about your field research.
Mm,
What role does it play in your work, and what does it give you
mm,
experientially that you
mm.
you you can't get just thinking about these things and writing about these things?
Oh, my field work is absolutely essential to me. In so many ways, but it's I've always done it. So even when I was really young, I studied at Oxford and I lived in Oxford for 8 years. And in that time, I lived in somewhere called Oceany Island, which is a little kind of islet within the river system that has been, that people live on now. And I used to, when I had a thought that was bothering me, I would
Mhm.
just go out of the door and I would just go onto the river pathway and I would roam and just carry the thought with me the whole of the walk. And I think it's one of the reasons that I love Aristotle so much, because I think that kind of tradition of thinking and walking your inquiry with you is something that I did before I sort of knew that there were people to imitate in this way. I just did it instinctively.
Mhm.
I've also always liked to be on the move, so I like to write on trains, for example,
Mm.
whereas other people find that impossible. I find it stimulating. I like to write on boats. I like to be in motion as I'm writing and thinking. So
Interesting.
there's that, which is a physical property, I would say, of my characteristic and the way that I think. Probably it's to do with stimulation, probably it's to do with arousal, but for sure that's what I'm doing. But then when it comes to how I bring the ideas alive, to go and see these people who were writing these papers or who were doing this kind of research. I need to understand a little about them, the context that they're in. I need to understand where these ideas are emerging from to think about them critically. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that I'm writing about the living world, and you cannot do that if you don't spend time in nature, if you haven't got lots of observational experience yourself, if you don't know what you're seeing, the birds and the flowers and the creatures, and so it's absolutely essential to me.
And it seems to me, I mentioned the Arctic and Antarctic. It seems to me you've chosen rigorous locales.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, well, when I was younger, oh my gosh, shall I confess this? Yeah, when I was younger, when I got my first computer and I was a teenager, when I was sort of late teenager, when I got my first computer, I had uh Ernest Shackleton's sort of uh in through strength we conquer kind of on my screen. I was always obsessed with the stories of explorers, but I particularly liked stories of individuals like Shackleton
Hmm.
who could drive themselves into these extraordinary circumstances and just bloody mindedly keep on going. And
Right.
the irony, of course, is that I don't have that kind of physical stamina. I'm like quite a petite person and I don't have great stamina, but I have good mental stamina. So it was
Uh,
really that part of it that I was sort of aspiring towards. Um, but it has been, even if my body can't always keep up, I'm always really drawn to the sort of remote and wild places, and I've just been really lucky that I've managed to go to some of them.
yeah, but also I would think the fact that the your relationship in those times with your environment is is a tough one. Is one that demands you be awake and demands you be alive, if you know what I'm saying. And I would think that has its own value. You know that
It
it's
does. I think whenever you travel, in any case, but particularly when you're traveling in places that are right at the edges of what is of where it's possible for our species to live. So
yeah.
one of the things I enjoy about the Arctic and the Antarctic, I mean, in the Arctic, of course, what you're seeing is places that are populated by human beings, but they're right at the thresholds of what's comfortable. And consequently, they've got all of these innovations and attitudes that have enabled them to exist in this real margin of what's comfortable for Homo sapiens. In Antarctica, there is no resident human population in that regard. There's scientific bases and infrastructure down there, research infrastructure and so on, but there's no history of human colonization down there. But so you get something different there, which is that you are in somewhere that doesn't echo back the human, and it also reminds us as a place that that we can be gone on, we can't survive here. If we make a mistake, that will be it. No one's going to come and rescue you. If so, it's very unforgiving and it's very unhuman in that way, which I have found very stimulating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just a quick question: what does it mean to be a National Geographic explorer? I'm not sure how many I've spoken with. Wade Davis on a few occasions.
Oh yeah.
Um, but what is it? What does it actually mean for you in your life and work today?
Yeah, this was a funny one because I wrote to National Geographic when I was like a little kid. I was probably, I don't even know, like maybe 10, 11 or something like that. Funnily enough, I also wrote to the RSPCA and sent them in my idea when I was like, again, probably similar kind of age, for my idea for a cat hotel. So I was one of those kids who was like looking at these places, where I could see people cared about nature or were involved in nature and thought, is there a place for me there? And then, of course, you forget about it for
Right.
decades. You find yourself in a situation where you're invited suddenly to be vice president of the RSPCA and sort of invited into the National Geographic. And I sort of took it in my stride because I'm quite a balanced person. I don't tend to have big highs and big lows. So I sort of just, I'm like, oh, okay, cool. And then I had to do this sort of orientation for National Geographic. And they show you this beautiful film, which includes Jane, of course. She's
Mm-hmm.
sort of front and center of it, of how much research and thought and science and anthropology and so on and storytelling that they have funded and supported in the previous decades. And I welled up. It was really, and they're welcoming you in, but it is a really beautiful legacy, and it's an enormous entity, the National Geographic. But I do feel proud to be a part of,
I see. Yes,
part of
right. I mean, what a validation that you are
yeah.
invited in by the people who sort of are the established center of what you've been thinking about since you were a kid.
Yeah, and especially as I think, as we've already described so far today, I am a bit of an outlier. I mean, it's unusual to work in classical music and work across all of these different different kind of areas. So I don't have I don't have an easy to pigeonhole career. So when establishments still recognise someone who's a bit of an oddball like that, then it's great.
Absolutely. And then finally, um, let's talk just a bit about your animal welfare work. The Nuffield
Mm.
Council on Bioethics, the RSPCA, Animals in the Room, and I'm going to ask you sort of clearly you've had this inclination since childhood. Um, when did you actually move into it? And sometimes people will take someone who has a name and give them a position that they don't really do all the work in. I'm sort of curious how much you are actually, showing
Doing
up for
anything.
these things. Yeah, what it means in your life. Yeah.
Yeah, so what happened with bioethics? So for listeners who are a little unsure what this is basically considering policy and ethics, what we should do and ought to do with regard to anything across really the life sciences. So that could be from sort of euthanasia, for example, gene editing, genome editing, all it's right across the medical and research sciences relating to life. How I got involved in that first was that I actually had been sort of doing an ad hoc bioethics in some ways through my research. I've been spending a lot of time with scientists at kind of frontier technologies. I was writing critically quite often and thinking critically about what was happening. But I also, through my experience, was a little concerned about the ethical literacy of some of the scientists, even really senior scientists that I was encountering, through no fault of theirs. But I was concerned, and so I reached out to the then chair, Dave Archard of Nuffield, to say, how does one get involved? And they happened to have an opening coming up for a council member. So I just entered the open call for it and was lucky enough to be selected. And so with Nuffield, it's very active, especially as I'm now deputy co-chair and I'm co-chair of environment and health priority area. And so yes, we are very actively involved in contributing to policy suggestions, ethical work, and it's really like being on a council in quite a sort of academic sense, and very policy facing. Then through that time, I my writing in general has had implications for animal welfare.
Sure.
With the RSPCA, they had asked me to contribute an essay
Hmm.
to something that they were doing, which I did. And then they asked me to talk, to be one of a few speakers who when the compilation of essays came out. And I think I was probably um, just it was really obvious that I was very passionate about it, and they then invited me to come on board, and I'm quite actively involved behind the scenes. In particular, most of the other main sort of public figures who are involved in the RSPCA have much bigger profiles than me, so they're sort of celebrities within the UK or senior politicians, for example.
Right. That's
Uh,
sort of what I was. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's sort of what I
yeah,
was referring to. Right.
exactly. Why they wanted me essentially is because the RSPCA was originally, set up by thinkers, by intellectuals, and they were wanting to think in fresh ways about welfare. So they had been keen to bring in people who were more at the edges of thought on this sort of thing, and I mean, it's lovely that they thought that I fitted the bill in that regard, but that's really more my role is to sort of provoke and to present, new ways of thinking about animal ethics and welfare into the future. And
That sounds. I mean, that makes really good sense to me. And hats off to them for thinking that way, because I can imagine you have a huge entity that people sort of know what it does. RSPCA, it's not a mystery, and you just keep raising money and doing what you're doing. And this idea that they want to look in the nooks and crannies for new new thought and new methods. I think I salute them for that.
yeah, no, they are massive and they still get just vast donations and they do incredible work that they could just sort of trundle along doing.
Yeah.
And so I agree. I mean, good for them that they're open to taking new directions and taking on board sort of difficult new kind of critical ways of thinking about welfare for the future. So it's been great. And then with Animals in the Room, I'm really actively involved in that. So
You
I
co-founded
co-founded
that?
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's something that came out of all of this work actually, which was that I could recognize from all of this that there is a really critical gap between nature, other species, and us. And in between that gap, our prejudices is sometimes just physical distance, that they're just not sort of visible in our lives anymore. Our biases, our objectification, all kinds of barriers. Sometimes it's just a little bit of discomfort, of uncertainty, but in any case, there's a gap there. And Animals in the Room is about knitting together, like dealing with that gap and bringing other species out from behind that sort of those barriers, so that their voices and their interests are more accessible to us.
Yeah, no, that sounds again like something which, if you might not notice that it didn't exist, but one,
Yes,
but once you do, then there certainly is a role to make it exist.
yeah,
You actually were part of the team who drafted the first Declaration on Animal Dignity in 2024. Can you
yeah.
tell us just what that is and sort of what your hopes for it are?
Well, yes. So, I mean, it'll take a while to catch on, as these things always do, but you plant the seed. It's funny because obviously in How to Be Animal, as you'll probably have noticed, I'm quite critical of the concept of dignity. I kind of rip it apart a bit, but
Hmm.
that's my job. That's what I do. I unpick, concepts, and I show their kind of genealogies, and I show their weaknesses, and that's kind of part of the way that I operate as a thinker. So I'd done that to dignity, but in doing that, I'd thought, well, let's not throw dignity out because dignity is incredibly useful. It's doing something really important for people, which is that it's putting in place a promise, if you like, a recognition that another individual, no matter who they are, where they are, what they are, matter in their own right for a range of different grounds, but they matter. And you don't worry about the grounds, really. The whole point of dignity is it's not like consciousness. It's not like any of these other sorts of ideas that we think ground our sort of moral significance. Dignity is there to say that you matter just for who you are. You matter whether you are 107, you matter when you're, 6 months old, you matter whatever kind of able-bodied or otherwise you are, you matter. And I'm going to make a promise to value you and respect you. And so dignity is a really, really wonderful abstract concept when you really think about it. But of course, once I started interrogating it, I was thinking, dignity is most often there to deal with vulnerability, to situations where we are vulnerable to people not thinking about us or treating us like that, and therefore to further harms that can follow as a consequence of that. So it's almost like a kind of amulet to save you from dangers, where you become vulnerable in some way.
Hmm.
And that applies so well to non-human life,
Oh my God.
particularly to
Yeah.
animals. Very often animals are in situations where they are incredibly vulnerable to vis-a-vis humans. And what a difference it makes if you look on that being, no matter, what they are, and think, well, no, you're owed a basic respect. I respect you for being alive. Respect you for being different. I respect you for being, who you are. And we're not talking about what duties necessarily follow from that. We're simply saying that you're owed a basic respect, and that respect should protect you to a certain extent from the worst kinds of abuses when you're kind of otherwise rendered an object. And so that was really why my interest in dignity. And I'm by no means the only person to say this. Someone like Martha Nussbaum would be a really obvious person to point out. But Laurie Gruen as well. There are other philosophers who have called for this. But the Declaration on Dignity came about really because there is a growing recognition that dignity is potentially a very significant new frontier for animal welfare.
Okay, let me tell people this is Freeform, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally, speaking today with Melanie Challenger, who writes on the relationship of humans to the living world. And as you can tell from the first half of this hour, does a lot more than that. Her books include How to Be Animal, What It Means to Be Human. And you can learn more, and you can learn more about all her different fields, really, at Melanie Challenger, one word, melaniechallenger.com. Um, let's talk a little bit about How to Be Animal. Since I sort of say that's what we're pegging this to, but as you can tell, I'm certainly not sticking to that. Um, how did this book come in your? In other words, it's your third or fourth. How does it? What sort of was the itch you scratched that you said, "Okay, this is the one I've got to write now"? Was there a moment you knew you had to write it, and what was that?
Not quite, because my books sort of emerge, if you like, from somewhere in the back of my mind, and then they slowly. Once it's seeded there, it's going to come forward. And be acted upon, but sometimes it takes a little while for it to come through. So the first book that I wrote in nonfiction as a single author was called On Extinction, and it's very much a young person's book. I wrote it, and researched it when I was quite young still, and it's sort of almost like a young person's exploration or inquiry into extinctions of many kinds, just even the concept of extinction, but really a way of kind of squaring up to the Anthropocene and trying to make sense of how we had ended up being such an intelligent, such a complex, such a socially integrated species, and yet at the same time so damaging to our life support systems and to the earth and to other species. So that was what that inquiry was all about for many years. And how to be animal really was seeded right back then, even though it took a long time to sort of come forward. So I started researching towards it, probably 10 years before I finally wrote it. And what had struck me the most was that there was a fear at play that I could see in
Mm-hmm.
our relationship to nature. And in particular, it hadn't specifically located on animality, but I could see that there were tensions at work. And what really had taken my interest was different faculties of our psychology. So, in particular, dehumanization was something that had interested me. Part of that was because I was studying back then the way in which we had destroyed other cultures. So, in particular, the sort of extinction of cultural diversity,
Other human cultures,
other
exactly.
human
Yes,
cultures.
yes. By
Indeed.
othering and diminishing, etc. Yes.
Yeah, and outright extirpating
Yeah.
in some
No, no, I
cases.
mean, but the seed is in the othering and the diminishing. And
Yes.
then, I mean, and there's a whole thing, even as we look at fascism, right? That if you can reduce the other, whether it be the Jews, the gypsies, blacks, whatever, if you can reduce them to being less than human, then everything else goes on from there. Go on.
Well, indeed. And so I was interrogating that. And what I noticed was that although there are multiple forms of dehumanization, so for instance, you can use robots as the sort of metaphor, if you like, and say people, someone's robotic, they're like an object, and therefore they don't matter, they're less human. But the most common form of dehumanization is to say other people are like animals.
Mm-hmm.
And you find it really in all cultures and you find it throughout history. So it's incredibly deep seated in human beings to do this. And that struck me as being incredibly significant. Why are we using other animals and what does that say both about our relationship to other animals and about our relationship to being human? So that was really the starting point.
Right. It sounds like
Um,
what they call in poker, I guess, in gambling, a tell, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So that became the kind of first line of inquiry, but I was also curious about dualism, and this has remained a particular focus for me. So why is it that we have often seen ourselves as split between a spiritual part and a physical part?
Mm-hmm.
And when you really look into this, you find that as a general rule, the physical part of us, the animal bit, if you like, is seen as less valuable, less important. It's the spiritual bit of us, and this spiritual bit of us is usually the immortal bit of us that we say really matters. And a lot hangs on that. A lot of our world hangs on that. You said right at the outset that you already know that we're animals. You kind of have got that one.
Right.
And I got this from certain readers. They'd be like, why did we need this like book by this crazy lady telling us that we know that we're animals. We don't need to be told this. But actually, you do have to stop and consider the fact that most of our world is built around the idea that we're not.
Let me just jump in for a quick second, Melanie, because my next question that you've
Right.
walked right into was going to be, I am curious, and you probably know to some extent the answer to this. How prevalent is the notion that we are part of nature, that we are animals? How much is, how little, how much is that? And how does it break out in terms of by age or country or culture, religion, those sorts of things? Because as I say, to me, it's like the sky is blue. It's about that controversial, but I know that's not the case.
Yeah, so it's absolutely the most dominant perspective on the planet that we might at some level for it, consider ourselves animals, but not fully. So what I mean by that is if you are there are many belief systems that would not see us as animals, would identify us as humans and animals. They would see a separation there. That may be through spiritual thought, for example, where humans are made in the image of God, and then animals are to a certain extent following their own separate sort of genealogy. That it could be to do with ensoulment, that humans are seen as having a soul or a spirit and other living beings aren't. So some of it is theological, some of it is spiritual. But even among quote unquote secular or scientific perspectives, it is incredibly common to have something that looks suspiciously like that kind of dualism, that kind of unique human exceptional something or another that's not quite found in the body in a straightforward way in the mind. So human consciousness has come to stand for something that's really quite similar to the human soul, if you will. And so even among secular thinkers, we can find something that's quite related, which is the idea that we maybe have a mind that could be separated from our body. We have a mind that is unique to us. We have a mind that gives us unique human status that no other living beings have. That
This is basically Descartes. I think, therefore I am, right?
yeah, Descartes gets such a hard time. I mean, yes, it is. Everyone blames
That's
Descartes.
true. To be known for one line.
Yeah. It's like, I sometimes wonder what he would think if he could come back now and see the fact. But yes, I mean, he certainly was the most influential thinker in some ways, to
Yeah,
argue
but
this.
I realize I was using him just as a placeholder. I'm really saying he
No,
is
but
right.
everybody does.
But
Everybody
everybody does.
does.
It's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's, you know,
And he
but
was incredibly influential, and you can track that. You can see how many people were talking about the things that he'd written in the kind of decades immediately afterwards. He was a parlor discussion.
right,
It
right.
had huge influence. So that's fair,
But
but
the basic notion that it is our mind that separates us from others, and that it is our mind that makes us human, right? That's what I was just pegging to, that
yeah.
became in the Enlightenment, at least among some, the prevalent notion.
That's right, and it became a grand solution to those who wanted to still continue to carve up the world between humans that matter and everything else that doesn't. It gave a solution to that if you weren't going to carry through God and the soul. And and so we find that there's a sort of sometimes even in people who are really convinced that humans are animals in a straightforward way and might see themselves as very unfussy thinkers, that they nonetheless struggle if you ask them, well, yeah, but why do you matter so much more than Happy the elephant or a Western gorilla, mountain gorilla, or what exactly is different between us and our nearest relative, the chimpanzee? Like, why exactly should we have complete moral status and they have none? They might have conservation status, they have no legal or moral standing. Why? And you will find that people really flounder and flap around because it's actually really difficult to answer that question in purely scientific terms. We tend to fall back on this idea that there is something about humans that is not quite animal. There's something about us that
Uh-huh,
is
uh-huh.
special, right?
I'll know it when I see it. One of those kind of things that clearly means you don't know it.
Yeah. Yeah, because there is no, we've inherited what is ultimately a spiritual belief.
Right. And
It's
then let me ask this, which clearly the book deals with. But is there is there a sort of a developmental process in this way of viewing things that led us astray? In other words, among the more indigenous, the less technological, etc., was there less alienation from our animalness and from nature? And did it sort of did that the line get harder and harder as we progressed in certain directions?
Well, this is a question that really requires a lot of subtlety to answer, which we sort of is difficult to do in this kind of context. But I must say, I'm someone who doesn't like to think in kind of simplistic ways about indigeneity. There is no one kind of indigenous
Of
thinking
course.
for starters, but also it's actually quite complex. So one of the things that we can see that's very interesting is that there likely was some sort of shift. Now, this is very a little, is inevitably a bit sort of partial and speculative, but there does appear to have been a sort of shift in the iconography of early humans. So we're not really talking about kind of when everyone was indigenous, if you like. So
Yeah,
really early human beings would draw other living creatures in as the stars of the show, if you like, in where humans were sort of just blended with them, or sometimes not even there, or sometimes in the background, quite reverential. Um, when we get our first kind of early city states, so people are sort of accumulating resources and staying in one place, this is maybe sort of 12, 13,000 years ago, you start to find a shift in the iconography and you find that human beings are now placed either at the center or above or in a more kind of dominant iconography. Now, this isn't true everywhere because it never is with human beings.
of
We're diverse,
course.
but there is something at work there that is interesting. And these would be in societies that in all other ways we would really see as utterly different to kind of modern,
But this
Western
shift was already
societies.
showing up.
But the shift was already there. So there's a potential. And why I point this out is because if you are exploiting other living beings, if you're eating them, hunting them, wearing them, I think there is a potential for building narratives or stories or cultures that ease that or
Yeah, to
that
give you permission.
justify that, regardless of whether you are in kind of east, west, north, south, past, future, wherever
Hmm.
you are. That is a human tendency, and we can see it. Um, that said, of course, one of the things that I think we find in Indigenous communities is that there's more sacralization. So, what I mean by that is there's more of a tendency to view other living beings as humans as continuous with living beings, to view other living beings as kin in some cases, and
Hmm.
also to view that kind of relationship as one of that is sacred, which does lead to very different kinds of ethics, very different kinds of actions and behaviors. Whereas what we tend to find in modern, more urban, and certainly in post-industrial societies is that the same sort of navigation of the relationship with other living beings, particularly those that we're exploiting, tends to come through objectification, through denigration, rather than by making other living beings sacred. So I think that's one of the most stark, differences that we can see.
Yeah. I think, by the way, and this is me sitting, sitting in a home in Long Beach, not out in the field or anything, but it would seem to me that that separation um, begins to be part of everything. That technology sort of pulls us away from even other humans and so on. But right, with our what we see what our screens are doing to young people, for instance.
Well, I think this is something that's going to occupy my thought quite a bit in the coming few years. And it really came out from in the book that I've been writing recently, which is much more about sort of just what it is to be alive, what life is. And,
Ah,
and um, through that, of course, you start mulling what isn't alive, or things that we claim are alive, like AIs, but maybe aren't alive. what's interesting about now, as you say, is that on the one hand, you would think, or we often talk about these technologies as tools of connection,
Right.
tools of communication. Of course, tools that we come up with always have dual purposes. And the strangeness of these current technologies that have been really a consequence of the digital revolution is that they pull in two opposite directions. They do provide connectivity, but they also provide greater distance, and of course they are used as tools of group, the worst kind of groupishness, the worst kinds of separation from one another. And I do worry that we have got very distanced, not just from other living beings and from natural places and from everything that's beyond us, but from ourselves, from our own physical bodies. It's a kind of madness if young people who have these incredible, vibrant, strong bodies that are humming with intelligence are sat hooked up to a machine for hours on end in ways that are nothing to do with their own well-being, ultimately, which
Wow.
is to do with dis.
You know what came up for me as you said that is I am 77. When
Good for
I
you.
when I look back on what it was like to be 35 or
Mm.
40 or 45 and play basketball anytime on a cement court and feel fine the next day and all of that, I mean that silly thing of how youth is wasted on the young. I mean, I'm just at that point where I'm feeling, oh my God, what a gift they have. And as you're saying, many of them are missing it.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is to be alive. So, and one of the things that I had to really battle with this current book, which is called Alive, but was the fact that I had to really make a bit of a claim about the individual that's a little against the current environmental trend for sort of interdependence and interrelationality and sort of suppressing the individual and so on. I understand that that's to counteract what they see as a kind of poisonous, sort of self-interested, a damaging kind of capitalist individual
Right,
of the
right.
modern age. I get that. Nonetheless, when you try to make sense of what life is, you absolutely have to center the body. And to center the body, you have to understand the body as an individual, a distinguishable individual. And I really mean that. And I mean that against, I
Well, this
mean
is
that.
this is this is a trend in your work. I mean, a question which I hadn't gotten to answer, and we're right near the end of the hour, was that you point out that science pays more attention to genes and to communities than it does to individual organisms.
Well, that's right. We've had this strange disappearance of the body or denigration of the body, which was right through How to Be Animal and then has come to be the center of my latest inquiry, which is to understand what it is to be alive. What I find so thrilling about interrogating life is a reawakening to the brilliance of the living form. The living form, I think, is absolutely astonishing in the cosmos. And I mean, in all of its iterations, from an E. coli cell, single cell, through to a complex, beautiful human being, the living form is extraordinary, but you have to be willing to identify it, and you can only identify it if you look at the body. But what the body does is communicate constantly throughout its entire kind of coordinating whole. And through that, we're able to generate the values by which we live. We're able to become these meaningful interfaces between us and the rest of the cosmos, us and the rest of the environment. And what's so sad about what's going on now is that we're hooked up to machines that are not part of our bodies, actually. I don't believe we're in a sort of cybernetic revolution. They're not part of our living bodies and they're not alive and they don't care about us. And yet they are sort of feeding ideas into us that can often be harmful or detrimental, as well as activities that pull us away from what it is to be alive and active in the world. So I'm kind of hoping that the young people are going to march the big switch off, really. We'll see.
Yeah, we've got to pull it to a close. I feel like we sort of dipped a toe or a finger into strains of thought and questions and so on, and that's all we have time for in an hour. But this has been for me very like a refreshing dip in in a nice chill pool of perspectives and questions and thoughts and so on. And so let me tell people, the book we focused on was How to Be Animal, but I am very much looking forward to the next one, which is going to be called
Alive.
Alive. Okay. And you can learn more about all of Melanie's questions, researches, and so on at melaniechallenger1word.com. For this conversation and many other interviews and articles, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY.net, or a world that just might work.com. They're the same website. If you want to get my weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and links to 10 or 15 articles to flesh out the conversation, email me at temcnally, TEMCNALLY, at mac.com. And you can find archives with hundreds, I've been doing this for 25 years, hundreds of conversations at my site, terrencemcnally.net, or at most of the podcast sites, Apple and Spotify and all of those and so on. You'll find years of podcasts in those archives. And finally, you can follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to Kiana Williams in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all, you, my listeners, please share this podcast widely. And finally, thank you, Melanie Challenger. Keep up your good work, and I look forward to talking with you about the next book.
Sounds good. I'll look forward to it.
Okay, great. Thank you again.